Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching how war in Ukraine is destroying Russia by Real Life Lore. I know this is a little different than what we usually watch on this channel. So far the channel has been composed entirely of history reactions, but I enjoy this sort of current events geopolitical content on my own time, and I think history is very relevant, History is relevant to current day politics. If we want to understand why geopolitics and foreign relations are how they are, then we have to look back at history. That's definitely true for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. History played a big role in Putin's attempted justification of the invasion. So yeah, I'm excited to get into this video. Before we do, I'd appreciate it very much if you guys would hit that subscribe button. And with that out of the way, let's jump into this reaction.
This video is made possible by Curiosity Stream and Nebula. Watch another brand new full-length companion video to this one in my ongoing Modern Conflict series that covers the second phase of Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine, along with 18 other full-length episodes with over 6 hours worth of combined content, covering over a dozen other major 21st century conflicts. All of which you can access by signing up for the Curiosity Stream Nebula bundle deal for less than $15 a year at curiositystream.com/RealLifeLore.
That's a good deal, guys. Make sure to go and check out Real Life Lore's video. It's linked in the description. Go check out their sponsor, leave them a like, all that good stuff. Show them some support.
Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine more than 8 months ago is leading not only to the destruction of Ukraine, but to the destruction of Russia itself.
This is true. And just on a quick note, it is crazy that it's been 8 months already. In the first place, I think a lot of people were shocked that the invasion even happened. But I can tell you that I think many of us never expected it would go on for this long. We're coming up on the end of the year. Soon it's going to be an entire year before this war started. It's really dragging on, and lately it's been going well for Ukraine, so that's fantastic. But it just is crazy that this massive, large-scale war in Europe has been dragging on for so long.
Tens of thousands of people on both sides have already lost their lives over this conflict. And that's in addition to the more than 7.5 million Ukrainians who have left their country as refugees.
Wow.
And the more than 1 million Russians who have left theirs as exiles. On September...
As we've seen, particularly following the implementation of partial mobilization in Russia, not a full draft, but partial, a lot of Russians are fleeing to any country they can get into, Georgia, Armenia, etc., any country that'll let them in, because right now a lot of European countries are not allowing Russians to get visas. You have tons of Russians fleeing, and of course Ukrainians have been fleeing from the warfare in their country since the beginning of the war.
21st, Putin announced the first wartime mobilization of men in Russia since the Second World War. A call for at least 300,000 additional men to be drafted and sent to the front line in Ukraine to fight and potentially to die. Within hours of that announcement, the prices for flights going anywhere outside of Russia skyrocketed to never-before-seen rates, as hundreds of thousands of Russian men suddenly became desperate to leave their country and escape.
Yeah. And, fair enough. There's no point going to die in a war that you don't believe in. It's also very concerning because, of course, what we want is this war to be brought to an end. And Putin, calling for 300,000 more troops tells us that he's not really interested in bringing the war to an end anytime soon. He wants to keep fighting. Or at least he wants to establish a better position before he goes into negotiations. But it's basically really not a good sign.
But they had and continue to have very limited options for escape. For months beforehand, nearly every country in Europe and North America had blocked off their airspaces to all Russian flights. And nearly every European-based carrier had shut down their flights to Russia as well. By the time of Putin's mobilization announcement, there were only 2 European-based carriers remaining operating flights to Russia: Air Serbia out of Belgrade and Turkish Airlines out of Istanbul. For any Russians fleeing the country by commercial air to Europe, these were the only 2 choices to pick from, and so their prices temporarily exploded to more than 9,000 euros for a one-way economy fare ticket out of Moscow, which is more than half the median annual salary for everyday Russians. Most everyday Russians simply couldn't afford that high of a price to fly to Europe to escape. but it started becoming increasingly difficult to escape by land as well. By the end of September, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and even Finland had each taken the unprecedented step to completely lock their land borders down with Russia.
Yeah. As I said, Russians cannot get into a lot of countries, either because they can't get a visa, and that's true for a lot of countries, or they simply can't get to those other countries. They can't afford a flight, and they can't go through the land borders to these Western countries, and so the few borders that they can get through, say to Georgia and a couple of other countries, are increasingly swamped by thousands and thousands of Russians trying to escape.
Denying anyone with Russian citizenship entry for any reason, even if they held valid visas. That meant that travel by land to Europe was also mostly impossible for Russians fleeing the country. Unless, of course, they wanted to book it through the active war zone in Ukraine. The only possible...
I mean, that would be quite a bold journey to make. You're a Russian citizen fleeing, and you make the decision to flee through your own front lines through Ukraine. I can't imagine that would go well for you. Yeah, that would be a pretty crazy way to go.
Land route to Europe for escaping Russians still remaining as of the production of this video is through the very narrow sliver of Norway in the far northwest of the country. Norway has still not shut down their small border here with Russia yet, and the E105 highway that leads to it beyond Murmansk continues to remain open for now. But for
it's probably because it's so remote. I'm sure they've seen increased traffic through that area since the war began, but I imagine that, it's probably still not that many people. As if Finland opened up its borders, you would see tons and tons of Russians flooding in.
For most Russians fleeing the consequences of this war, the route to Norway is thousands of kilometers away from them and difficult and expensive to get to. At the same time, an estimated 70% of Russian citizens don't even possess a passport that's required for international travel like this. And that means that for most Russians wanting to flee the country, their only really good options are to the south in the former Soviet countries of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, and Armenia, where they can all still enter without visas and some even without passports. As members of the Eurasian Economic Union, basically Russia's version of the European Union, Russians entering into Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia retain the right to live and work within them, making them the easiest and the cheapest countries for Russians to escape into. As a result, satellite imagery taken on September the 25th shows a huge traffic jam of desperate Russian vehicles attempting to cross the border into Georgia.
Yeah. Georgia seems to be one of the most popular spots. We've been seeing reports about Tbilisi being flooded with Russian refugees. That's the capital of Georgia, by the way. So there are tons of Russians entering Georgia. I'm kind of surprised that Georgia is still letting them in, but of course keep in mind that Georgia had its own war with Russia a couple of years ago, and Russia still, there's technically independent territory of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, but basically Russia occupies them. Kind of a similar situation to eastern Ukraine before the war, so Georgia might feel some military pressure to keep their border open to Russians, as if they closed it off, who knows what Russia would do. But I don't know, it's kind of a complicated situation, of course, because, the Russian government doesn't want their people fleeing into Georgia. So I'm not really sure what has motivated Georgia's decision to keep their border open, as opposed to a lot of other countries that have closed them. Maybe some of you have some more insight into the political motivations behind that.
Essentially as long as 30 kilometers or 19 miles. In a similar fashion, queues of Russians in cars attempting to enter Kazakhstan can be seen in video clips stretching for nearly as far as the eye can see. Hundreds of thousands of Russians have already made it down to these four countries, and more coming down all the time. But they're not the only places that Russians are escaping to. In one particularly desperate and bold case, 2 Russian men evading the draft acquired a boat in the remote far eastern town of Ekvekanot and sailed at nearly 500 kilometers across the Bering Sea to the American town of Gamble on Alaska's St. Lawrence Island, where they immediately requested asylum and were flown over to Anchorage by U.S. officials for processing.
Yeah, are we even letting Russians in? I imagine many of them have not tried to flee to the United States like some of these other countries, but I'm not sure if their request for asylum would even be approved.
Many more who couldn't escape or leave for whatever reason began searching on Google how to break their own arms or limbs just in order to avoid the draft.
Yeah.
The day after Putin's mobilization announcement, the term "how to break an arm at home" became the top search trend on Google within Russia. In total, within nearly a month of Putin's announcement of partial military mobilization in Russia, more than 700,000 people, most of them young military-age men, have fled the country to somewhere else abroad. More than double the amount of men that Putin announced he was planning on having drafted.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a horrible situation all around, but, you know, if we look at the war effort, there have been questions about to what extent the Russian population supported the war effort, and there's definitely a lot of people in Russia who do support the war, but the fact that this many people have fled shows that they're not willing to put their lives on the line for the war. You know, they have no real faith in the government or in what they're doing. So in some way, I suppose that's a little encouraging. You know, it's a bit of a silver lining in a terrible situation all around, I guess.
This is also in addition to the more than 500,000 Russians who had already left the country before the mobilization was even announced. People of all different kinds, from YouTubers, journalists, and political refugees fearful of 15-year jail sentences for opposing the war online, to millionaires fearful of losing their assets in the West, to tech workers fearful of losing their Western jobs, alongside many others.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of Western banks, a lot of Western companies, including Google, YouTube, by the way, cut off payments to Russia or Russian citizens or Russian banks. And so if you're someone who lives in Russia and you're employed by a Western tech company, or if you're a YouTuber, for example, then you may not be able to get paid right now. No fuckers, profane name, but Roman, that's the guy's name from that channel. He's a Russian YouTuber who, you know, I've been following for a while, and, you know, he fled Russia to Georgia. His journey's been very interesting. I think he's representative of a lot of higher-earning Russian individuals, people who work for tech companies, IT guys, YouTubers, who were sort of early to flee, but now they're being followed by swarms of Russians from all backgrounds who are just desperate to escape the country at any cost.
Means that at least 1.2 million Russians have left the country since the invasion of Ukraine began, representing the largest exodus of Russians from the country in history since the 1917 October Revolution and the Bolshevik rise to power. And that isn't even to say anything of the unknown numbers of Russian men getting killed and maimed for life in Ukraine, which, according to U.S. estimates, is already at least 70 to 80,000 killed and wounded, with Ukrainian losses in life probably being very similar, already making it the deadliest war seen in Europe in generations since 1945. And all of this loss of people, either to warfare or to migration, is only exacerbating what was already arguably Russia's and Ukraine's biggest problem before the war. Their populations were each already in a terminal decline for decades, and this war is only making that problem a lot worse.
Yeah, I'm sure.
It can get so bad that within 20 years from now, we may not even recognize either Russia or Ukraine as countries in the same way we see them today.
I mean, Russia in particular has been having population issues since the 90s. I mean, similar to a lot of Eastern European countries following the collapse of the USSR, there was a massive decrease in the standard of living, decrease in life expectancy, and a lot of countries have struggled to recover. Russia's one of them. It seemed like there was recovery for a couple of years in the 2000s. There was economic recovery as Putin increasingly gathered power, but of course everything's gone terribly, particularly since the invasion of Ukraine. So yeah, the Russian population is not doing well right now. Of course, not even to mention the Ukrainian population, who, you know, their country is embroiled in an active war. That's about the worst thing that could happen. So yeah, this is, you know, obviously really doing a number on the populations of both countries, and it's kind of hard to tell where this is going to go, how both countries are going to be after the war, because we don't know how the war is going to end or how long it will drag on for. There's a lot of questions.
And they may no longer even exist as we know them. Let me explain a little bit what I mean. This on the left is the population pyramid of Russia. While this on the right is the population pyramid of Ukraine. These graphs are essentially a snapshot of both countries' populations that reveal the numbers of people of all ages and genders, and they both appear very similar, which is a bad thing. At the top of each, you can see these gaps in people in their 70s. The World War II generation that suffered tens of millions of people dead in both countries. To be born a boy anywhere in the Soviet Union in 1923 was perhaps the single worst time, place, and gender to have been born across most of human history.
God damn. That's quite the claim. I'm curious to see, how they explain that. But the Soviet Union really took a beating during World War II. I mean, if we look at the war effort, the Nazis made a surprise attack on the Soviet Union, though in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't too surprising. Hitler had always wanted to expand eastwards. And if we just look at the pure numbers, the USSR put the most amount of people into the war out of the Allies, I think. They had massive amounts of people fighting, massive amounts of people dying. I mean, the USSR basically single-handedly pushed Germany westwards. Of course, the other allies, America, Britain, they were fighting on other fronts, but the Eastern Front, that is the Soviet Union. So a combination of that and also Stalin's brutal policies, he would not accept surrender or retreat. He would fight every step of the way until the brutal end, combined to a massive loss of life in the USSR during the Second World War.
3.4 million boys were born in the Soviet Union that year. And by the time these 3.4 million boys would be 23 years old at the end of 1946, more than 2/3 of them would already be dead.
Jeez.
To have been born male in the Soviet Union in 1923, you had less than a 1 in 3 chance of surviving beyond your 23rd birthday. The loss in life of so many young people like this throughout the 1930s and 40s meant that a lot of young people at that time in both Ukraine and Russia were never able to have any children. And that meant the kids they never had simply didn't exist around 20 years later when they would normally also be having their own kids, causing a population hit or echo of the lost World War II generation around here in the mid to late 1960s.
And, compare that to countries like the United States. The United States probably came out the best after World War II. A lot of Western European countries were devastated as well, France and Britain certainly hadn't had a good time during the war. And the United States did lose a lot of soldiers, but if we look at the United States post-World War II, it was economically very powerful, politically very powerful, and compared to other countries like the USSR, it hadn't lost nearly as many people. So the US had a population boom, an economic boom, all that good stuff, versus the USSR, which, certainly would go upwards following the war, but, it was a struggle, they had been hit hard by World War II.
Reduce their population equivalent of Gen Xers. These echoes of the lost World War II generation continue to ripple across both Russian and Ukrainian society about every 20 to 25 years. But the two most recent ripples hitting the Zoomers, and whatever generation is being born now will be called, have come almost precisely at times of other great national crises, which only exacerbated their problems for both countries' populations. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed just as the second echo of the lost World War II generation was starting. With the collapse in Soviet-era state services and structures came a rocketing in the rates of alcoholism, opioid use, suicides, crime, and HIV/AIDS that...
Yeah, this is what I mentioned earlier. I actually have a main channel video about this topic. But following the collapse of the Soviet Union, as I said, life got incredibly bad for most people in the former Soviet Union. If we just talk about Russia in particular, life expectancy dropped, standard of living dropped. Russians did not have access to any of the social services that they'd had before. It was just an absolute mess of a decade. So the 90s were a terrible, terrible time for Russians and most people in Eastern Europe. And so that really hit the population hard. So yeah, that's what he's talking about now.
Plagued the populations of both Ukraine and Russia alike for years afterwards, and caused each of their life expectancies, especially for men, to plummet.
Yeah.
Throughout the mid-1990s and early 2000s, the life expectancy for Russian and Ukrainian men alike were 17 years fewer than men over in Western Europe. and 13 years fewer than their female counterparts. They were nearly on a par with men in Afghanistan and many sub-Saharan African nations, despite being at peace. And at the same time, rates of migration abroad following the collapse of the Iron Curtain and communism exploded, as millions of Ukrainians and Russians sought out better opportunities for themselves and their families abroad over in the West.
Yeah.
And simultaneously, as the death and migration rates were skyrocketing in the 90s, the numbers of births to replace them were plummeting, a situation which continues to this day.
Well, you know, the USSR had been dismantled, Russian state institutions were incredibly weak. You had these oligarchs buying up all these different companies, leaving the regular people with nothing. So if you could afford to leave at that point in the 90s, you would leave. You know, you had no reason to stay in Russia for terrible standards of living, terrible social services, just it was a really bad situation after the USSR collapsed. And so if you were able to, if you had the resources, you would probably flee west. And of course, as we know, if you have a country in crisis, the population is declining, standard of living is declining, the amount of births is declining, that will cause people to leave. And so it's a cycle, you know, people leaving makes things even worse. And so now you have just a really bad situation, which was the 1990s for most of Eastern Europe.
Ukrainian women, even before the invasion, were only having an average of 1.16 children each, the second lowest rate of births anywhere in the world, just behind South Korea, and well beneath the natural population replacement level of 2.1 births per woman. And unlike many Western countries that make up for their own low levels of births with high levels of immigration, Ukraine has had a net negative rate of migration for decades, with many times more people leaving every year than entering. So naturally, as a result of all these factors, the population of Ukraine has literally decreased every single year since 1993, down from a peak of nearly 52 million people right at the end of the Cold War to just over 41 million immediately before the invasion.
And, I mean, you know, all of Eastern Europe would lose population following the collapse of the USSR, but of course, Ukraine was a particularly tough example because you have things like Euromaidan, the Russian invasion of Crimea. You know, we can see massive population drops after those events. So Ukraine had additional challenges to face, a lot of which caused by Russian interference. So while the entire region was losing population, a lot of Eastern European countries did somewhat recover in the 2000s and 2010s. They saw stagnations or increases in population, whereas somewhere like Ukraine, as we can see, has continued to lose massive amounts of people, as they said, even before Russia's invasion.
When also factoring in the 2.5 million people in Crimea who were lost to the Russians in 2014. Overall, this represents a crash of nearly 20% of the Ukrainian population in only 30 years. And Russia's situation isn't that much better. Plagued with largely the same societal and medical issues as Ukraine following the Soviet collapse, in the 30 years now since 1992, Russia has only ever seen 3 years of population growth between 2013 and 2015.
Yeah, so we can see this is a little more representative of the rest of Eastern Europe, though I think Russia's still probably got it worse than other countries nearby. But you can see there was a bit of a recovery going into the 2000s and 2010s. This was true for a lot of countries in that region, but, you know, still not great.
While every single other year has been nothing but continuous decline, with a current birth rate of 1.5 children per woman overall, and a slightly positive immigration rate of people mostly coming from Central Asia, the Russians have been losing people at a slower rate than Ukraine, but they've still been losing people. And the official numbers of births across Russia are also fairly deceiving, because Russia is a multi-ethnic country, and the ethnic Russians themselves are having far fewer children than their ethnic minorities are. This is a map of all the oblasts, republics, and provinces of Russia colored and numbered by birth rates seen a decade ago in 2012. And this is a map of all of Russia's various ethnic groups. And, as you can see, the regions of higher birth rates almost identically overlap with the regions of Russia's various ethnic minorities.
And keep in mind, there is more diversity within each of those regions, each of those oblasts, etc., etc. But yeah, Russia is an incredibly diverse country. They have a lot of different populations within their borders because, of course, The Russian Empire started out west and then over time expanded eastwards. And as they expanded eastwards, they took in a lot of different ethnic groups, religious groups, different peoples into their empire. And those people are obviously still there today. Maybe not obviously. We can look at other countries who murdered a lot of their indigenous people. But, you know, and I'm not saying the Russian Empire treated indigenous people in their empire well. Mainly just that Siberia and regions like that are extremely sparse. But yeah, there's a lot of different people groups in Russia. There's indigenous groups. There's a lot of Muslims in Russia. There's Turkic groups, Caucasian groups. We have people like the Chechens. They've had a lot of conflicts with the Russian government. So it is an incredibly diverse country. And, not all of those groups I just mentioned are super pleased with how the Russian government is governing. I mean, the Chechens are the best example. They've had several wars with Russia over the past couple of decades, which, the Russian government brutally put down Chechen rebellion. And so that's probably a region that would like to be let go if the opportunity was offered. Though I'm not sure how Chechnya is today. I just know that it historically has a tradition of rebellion against the Russian government.
Like in Buryatia, Sakha, Tuva, Dagestan, Chechnya, the North Caucasus, and Tatarstan. Many of these ethnically distinct regions of Russia already enjoy a large degree of autonomy from the central government in Moscow, and almost operate like quasi-independent countries. And some of them, like Chechnya and Dagestan, have previously fought bloody wars of independence from Russia in very recent history that failed, but may not fail again. As the population of Russians continues to decline, while the populations of these groups continues to increase, they may demand more autonomy from Moscow or even independence once again.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good point. Russia's really struggling right now, economically and militarily against Ukraine. If, the Chechen people could get together and try another rebellion, another war of independence. Like I said, I don't know what the current political climate is in Chechnya, but maybe it wouldn't fail this time because the Russian Empire really has been brought to its knees. But I don't know. The people of Chechnya have tried to fight for their independence before, and it was brutally crushed. So I'm not sure if it would happen again. And I'm also not sure if it would go differently. Perhaps.
And if one of them ever becomes successful in the future, like Chechnya, it could trigger a cascading effect of more and more of the other internal republics declaring their independence as well, and lead to a dissolution or even collapse across the Russian Federation.
But yeah, I mean, if one of these regions managed to gain its independence, like Chechnya, I think he's exactly right. Like the Soviet Union, you could see a cascading number of these republics voting for independence and leaving, which would basically break up the Russian Federation, or, you could call it the Russian Empire. That's what I've been calling it. I know that, the empire ended with the fall of the Tsars, then we had the USSR, but, Russia is clearly still trying to expand its empire. But you could see the collapse of the Russian Federation if one of these republics manages to leave. I don't know. I don't know how likely this is. We have to see how bad it gets for Russia. They've already been brought to their knees economically. So if it continues to decrease and decline at this rate, then, you could see some catastrophic events in, a year from now, a couple of years, I don't know.
And while that might seem unlikely right now, remember that Russia has been a multi-ethnic empire for centuries and has already collapsed twice in the previous century, in 1917 and again in 1991. There is no guarantee with its population crisis and badly going war in Ukraine that it won't or can't happen sometime again this century. But even with the seizure of Crimea from Ukraine in 2014 that theoretically added 2.5 million people into Russia, Russia's overall population today is still lower than it was before the collapse of the Soviet Union by nearly 1 million people. Which wasn't helped out at all by the years of the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020 and 2021 alone, due to excess COVID-19 deaths and a still very low birth and migration rate, the Russian population lost 1.7 million people.
Damn. Well, we are covering a lot of topics in this video, but yeah, The COVID pandemic went pretty badly in Russia. The government response was not so great. And yeah, they were one of the countries that was hit pretty hard and faced a lot of deaths due to COVID.
The largest loss of people ever in Russia during peacetime, and the largest loss in general since the Second World War. And now, in 2022, with the unleashing of the biggest war seen in Russia and Ukraine since the Second World War, this population problem for both of them that has been going on for the past 30 years now is only going to get way, way worse than it even already was. For Ukraine, at least 7.6 million people have evacuated the country and become refugees since the invasion began, meaning that nearly 1 in 5 Ukrainians before the invasion have left the country in less than 8 months.
Wow.
That is a similar loss in population that Ukraine experienced over 30 years between the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Russian invasion itself. And
yeah, but if the war ends favorably to Ukraine, and that's a big if, of course, you could see a lot of those people flooding back in because, most of those people fled the country to countries like Poland, neighboring countries who graciously accepted Ukrainian refugees and housed them and set them up, which was, very good. That is a good thing to do. So if the war ends favorably for Ukraine, a lot of those people will probably want to go home. But of course, that all depends on how the war goes, how it goes for Ukraine, how and if it ends.
Implies that there's only around 33.5 million Ukrainians remaining within the country right now. Nearly 20
But yeah, that's still a catastrophic population drop, even still.
million less than there were immediately after the Soviet collapse. And of course, that is to say nothing of the unknown numbers of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians alike who have lost their lives or become catastrophically injured since the invasion began, which is almost certainly a very high number stretching into the tens to hundreds of thousands. Ukraine will never be the same again after this war is over.
No, it'll be devastated. It's a shame you want to talk about Ukraine's potential recovery, but Russia is intent on continuing to fight this war. Putin is, like we mentioned earlier, calling up 300,000 more men. So it unfortunately seems like the war won't be coming to an end anytime soon. So we're not even at the point where we can talk about the recovery from the war, because it seems like the war is going to continue to drag on unless something changes. Ukraine is seeing successes right now, so that's great. But I don't know. Yeah, it's a pretty stark situation. A lot of loss of life. Pretty terrible.
Even if they do push all the way ahead to ultimate victory. And while the raw numbers of Russia's exiles leaving the country are nowhere near as large or catastrophic as Ukraine's refugees, they're still pretty bad for Russia's internal demographics. Remember that the vast majority of the 1.2 million Russians who have already left so far are either highly educated or young, and especially are young men. Before the invasion, Russia had about 33 million young men between the ages of 16 and 49, who could theoretically be capable of military service. Conservatively estimating that around 800,000 of those men have since left the country, and at least 70,000 others have become killed or wounded in Ukraine so far, that is nearly 3% of Russia's total supply of men younger than 49, who will no longer contribute to the economy or the military so far. As the war in Ukraine continues to drag on and casualties continue to mount up, Putin will be forced into calling in more draftees and conscripts to replace the losses. And
yeah, like I said, at this point, anyone who can flee is fleeing, but in the beginning, and this is sort of the general trend, those who could afford to flee would flee. And so that means those who are well off, those who are economically productive, those who work for Western companies, which means they bring money into the Russian economy, like people working for tech companies or YouTubers, as I mentioned earlier. These are the people who are going to be disproportionately fleeing the country. And so that is a major brain drain. Russia's losing a lot of talented, qualified individuals, and a big economic drain. A lot of the money those people were producing, or a lot of the money those people were bringing into the Russian economy, is now going to go with them to those other countries they're fleeing to. So, Russia's already having enough economic problems from the sanctions, but this is only going to make it worse.
That means that more and more draft-age men are going to be leaving the country to escape it. In order to stop them from leaving, Russia will eventually be left with little other choice than to shut down their borders completely like during the Soviet era.
Yeah, and that is something that I could see happening. I mean, the stock of the Russian Federation collapsing is a little less realistic and a little more long-term, but the Russian government closing down its borders, I could absolutely see them taking that step in the future. I mean, they've gone for partial mobilization. It's not hard to imagine the government announcing full mobilization and a shutdown of the borders, because there's so many people bleeding from the Russian country into any other country that'll let them in.
And dramatically increase repression and surveillance at home, which will lead to people becoming even more desperate to leave and escape as Russia descends more and more into the authoritarianism and even totalitarianism of the past.
Yeah.
Russia has already lost more people this year than it has in any other year since World War II, breaking its own record for that was only set last year in 2021. How many
Jeez.
more will it and Ukraine lose by the time the war is over? And will either of them, with historically low birth and migration rates, ever be able to actually recover? I don't know the answer to either of those questions.
It's not something we can tell right now. I mean, surely both countries will be devastated for years, but, with us not knowing how things are going to go, I really can't tell you how long-term it's going to be for Russia or Ukraine. I mean, both countries potentially have an option to recover in the long term. It would require the war to end and a lot of economic support. And for Russia, it would probably require some sort of revolution to unseat the current government, unseat Putin. And all of that, who knows if that would ever happen. So while there is potential for recovery, at the moment, it seems a very long way off. And since we don't know how things are going to go in the short to mid-term, there's really no telling what's going to happen.
But it does appear that Putin is using the invasion of Ukraine to try and expand Russia's population and solve some of his own country's problem. Within days of ordering the mobilization on September the 30th, Russia unilaterally announced their annexations of 4 Ukrainian oblasts: Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, collectively representing about 15% of Ukraine's total territory, and the largest annexation or conquest of land seen in Europe since the Second World War.
And this, this was sort of one of the big goals Putin had in the first place, was that, and this is one of the things he used history to justify. His argument was that there was a lot of Russian-speaking Ukrainians, or a lot of culturally Russian Ukrainians, being abused by the government in eastern Ukraine, and therefore that gave him justification to invade. Russia's used this trick many times before. I'm reminded of Russia's many wars with the Ottoman Empire in the 18 and 1900s, where Russia would claim there were abuses against the Orthodox population in the Ottoman Empire, and then invade and take more territory. This is all for empire building. It's all realpolitik. The goal is to expand Russian territory. That was true then, and it's absolutely true now. And the vast majority of Putin's claims of abuse against Russian speakers and all that stuff was completely false. And even if there were, some, Russian-speaking Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine who were fans of the Russian government, now that has changed. I've seen news stories and reports about people who beforehand were more pro-Russian, but after the invasion, they've gone completely pro-Ukraine because they've seen the destruction that the Russian military has rained on their country, destroying their homes, their communities, killing civilians. So, this is just, it's a terrible situation. Overall, Russia's justifications for invading were completely false, and any truth that might have been there is now completely gone, So, yeah.
Only one other country in the world has so far recognized these Russian annexations as legitimate: North Korea, which I guess is unsurprising. And despite declaring them as Russian territory, the Russians themselves only occupy parts of each, with the Ukrainian military.
Yeah, and the Ukrainian military is increasingly pushing back. They have gained a lot of territory in the past couple of weeks. At one point, Russians controlled siphon off a ton of that territory we're looking at on the map, a big portion of eastern and central Ukraine. But now, the Ukrainians have really pushed them back pretty far.
Military still in control of large sections of each, including the capital of the Zaporizhia Oblast. But by declaring these territories as integral parts of Russia, Putin has given himself the legal ability to deploy freshly drafted conscripts to them to fight. Under Russian law, conscripts cannot legally be sent to fight in wars abroad and may only be used to defend the territorial integrity of Russia.
Wait, Putin's also trying to escalate the situation, right? What he does is he claims these territories are now part of Russia. And then what he says is, well, you can't infringe on Russian sovereignty. This is our territory. And then he can make bigger threats. He can deploy more troops. The threats to the world, I think, are the more frightening part. The threats of nuclear war and stuff like that. If anyone touches what he now calls, sovereign Russian territory, even though obviously it's still part of Ukraine. It's ridiculous. This is, once again, this is political moves. None of this is done genuinely, of course. This is just done, Putin is trying to further cement Russia's position because the war is going so badly for him.
So, now that Russia has declared these oblasts as parts of Russia, the hundreds of thousands of men being drafted can now legally be sent there to fight against the Ukrainians.
Yeah.
And, moreover, annexing them is stealing about 9 million civilians away from Ukraine and forcibly adding them into Russia, which, in Putin's mind, may be sufficient numbers to replace the people that his country is losing to casualties and exiles.
Yeah, though I don't think Putin's really thinking about population growth or increasing the population when he does this. Like I said, I think this is more a political move to try and cement the Russian position in eastern Ukraine, because the Russians have continually been pushed back over, the past couple of months.
But that's of course assuming that Ukraine, being increasingly well supplied with arms from the West, won't simply just recapture them and take all those people back, which continues to remain a possible, if not even plausible, scenario.
Yeah, I don't know. Ukraine's made a lot of progress recently, but it would definitely been tough. It will definitely be tough to completely push Russian forces out of Ukraine, so maybe that's still implausible, but they are moving the line forward, so we'll have to wait and see.
Of course, there's other reasons and explanations behind Putin's decision to invade Ukraine and escalate the conflict further. From Ukraine's recently discovered oil and gas reserves to Russia's own desire to expand their territory towards more geographically defensible frontiers. But regardless of Putin's justifications, the war in Ukraine is among the darkest chapters of 21st century history so far. And it is partially a consequence of Russia's own internal demographic crisis that has been going on for decades now. But, unfortunately, if I produced videos covering the war itself on YouTube, with the full details of what's actually happening on the ground and why it's all happening, the disturbing, violent, and controversial details of discussing a catastrophic ongoing war would cause the videos to become demonetized and age-restricted, which is something I completely understand and frankly agree with. I don't believe ads should be shown alongside suffering and tragedy, but it does ultimately mean that YouTube's algorithm wouldn't promote these videos to you because of their age restriction.
Yeah, I feel like we're kind of moving past the original topic, but yeah, YouTube's monetization system is interesting. I think it's gotten better. There's a little more self-control. And what I mean by that is there's more creator control. We have a little more control over that, and I think YouTube takes a little more account of the context, though it's still not great. And when I say it's a little better, just because it was really, really terrible at one point. But yeah, it's all right, and I understand what he's saying, so that makes sense.
And that means that you simply wouldn't ever see them here. And that's why instead, I created yet another full-length companion video to this one in my ongoing Modern Conflict series that I uploaded directly to Nebula, titled Russia's Invasion of Ukraine, Phase 2.
Alright, I think we're done with this one. So, go and check out Nebula, their sponsor, all that good stuff. They're promoting their content. That's a good thing. They're trying to create their own creator platform. That's awesome. So I enjoyed this one. It was a very interesting video. Like I said, it's different from what we usually do on this channel. So if you enjoyed it, I would very much appreciate if you'd leave a like, a comment, subscribe. Please check out the Patreon, linked in the description below, or become a channel member by hitting the join button next to the subscribe button for exclusive reaction content. I'm interested in covering more current events topics, more on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's a very tragic topic. And I wanted to wait a little bit before I did videos on the Russian invasion. Ideally, I was hoping to wait until the war was over, but that was sort of a hopeful prediction from about 6 months ago when we had no idea it would drag on for this long. So, I'm trying to do respectful coverage because I do think it's an interesting and very important topic. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you all are having a good day today, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye.